They say blood is thicker than water, but money can thin it down to nothing. And trust me when I say there's no betrayal that cuts deeper than watching your own grandson steal the last dollars from your trembling hands while promising to take care of you. I never thought I'd be sitting here at 73 years old, telling strangers about how my own flesh and blood robbed me blind, left me choosing between medication and groceries, only to have the audacity to throw himself a lavish birthday party with my stolen pension money. But here I am, and if you stay until the end, before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You'll understand why sometimes the most loving thing a grandmother can do is to let her grandson learn that stealing from the elderly isn't just morally bankrupt, it's actually bankrupt, period. My name is Dorothy Kellerman, and until 6 months ago, I was just another widow living quietly in Cedar Falls, Minnesota, surviving on a modest pension and the kindness of a grandson I thought loved me. For 47 years, I worked as a bookkeeper for Morrison & Associates, a small accounting firm downtown where I balanced other people's money with meticulous care, never taking so much as a paperclip that wasn't mine. When my husband Frank passed away 8 years ago from lung cancer, he left me with our small 2-bedroom house on Maple Street, a 2015 Honda Civic with 40,000 miles on it, and enough life insurance to cover the funeral expenses with a little left over for emergencies. I've always been what people call responsible with money. During my working years, I contributed faithfully to my pension, lived below my means, and saved what I could. Frank and I never took exotic vacations or bought luxury items. Our idea of splurging was dinner at Applebee's on our anniversary and maybe a weekend trip to see the fall colors up north. We were simple people who believed in honest work, paying bills on time, and helping family when we could. After Frank died, my pension kicked in, $1,147 per month. Not much by today's standards, but enough to keep me in the house we'd paid off, cover my utilities, buy groceries, and maintain my medications. For high blood pressure and diabetes, I'd learned to live carefully, shopping sales, using coupons, growing vegetables in my small backyard garden. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was mine, and I was proud that at my age, I could still take care of myself without being a burden to anyone. My son Douglas had moved to Seattle 15 years ago for work, something in software development that I never quite understood but was proud of nonetheless. He'd married a lovely girl named Coral, and they'd had my grandson Remy when Douglas was 32. After Douglas and Coral divorced when Remy was 12, my son threw himself into his career and climbing the corporate ladder, leaving Remy to shuttle between his parents during custody visits that grew increasingly infrequent as the boy got older. Remy had always been what teachers politely called challenging. Even as a small child, he'd had trouble with authority, with telling the truth, with respecting other people's belongings. Douglas would joke nervously about his son being too smart for his own good and questioning everything, but I could see the worry in his eyes. When Remy turned 18, he'd lasted exactly 1 semester at community college before dropping out, claiming the professors didn't understand his vision and that traditional education was for sheep. For the past 5 years, Remy had been drifting, working part-time jobs he'd quit or get fired from, pursuing various get-rich-quick schemes that never materialized, and occasionally showing up at my door when he needed a place to stay just for a few weeks, while he got back on his feet. Each time, those few weeks stretched into months, and each time I told myself this would be the period when he'd finally find his direction. 2 years ago, when Remy was 25 and had just been evicted from his apartment in Minneapolis for non-payment of rent, he arrived at my doorstep looking genuinely contrite. He'd lost another job, this time at a cell phone store, and admitted he'd been struggling with what he called financial management. He asked if he could stay with me not just temporarily, but long-term, so he could get his life together. and maybe even help me around the house. "Grandma Dorothy," he'd said, sitting at my kitchen table with that boyish smile that reminded me so much of Douglas at that age. "I know I've messed up a lot, but I want to do better. I want to take care of you the way you've always taken care of our family." I was lonely, more lonely than I'd admitted to myself, and the idea of having family in the house again felt like a blessing. Remy moved into the spare bedroom, the one that had been Douglas's childhood room, and for a while, things seemed to improve. He found a job at a local auto parts store, helped with yard work, and even cooked dinner occasionally. More importantly, he showed interest in helping me manage my finances. "Grandma, you shouldn't have to worry about all these bills and paperwork at your age," he'd say, watching me sort through my monthly pension statement and utility bills. "Let me help you get organized. I'm good with computers and online banking. I can set everything up so it's automatic and easier for you." It seemed practical when Remy suggested we add him to my checking account as a joint account holder. He explained that if anything happened to me, a fall, a medical emergency, a sudden illness, he'd be able to access my account to pay bills, handle expenses, make sure I was taken care of. He showed me articles online about elderly people whose accounts had been frozen during medical emergencies, leaving them unable to pay for care or medication. "It's just for protection, Grandma," he assured me. "I'm not going to touch your money. I just want to make sure that if you need me to help, I can actually help." The bank manager, a young woman named Addison who looked barely old enough to have a driver's license, walked us through the paperwork with professional efficiency. She explained that as a joint account holder, Remy would have full access to all funds, the ability to write checks, make withdrawals, and handle all banking transactions. She asked if I was sure I wanted to proceed, if I understood the implications, if I had considered other options like a power of attorney. "He's my grandson," I told her, feeling slightly offended that she was questioning my judgment. "If I can't trust family, who can I trust?" Looking back now, I realize that Addison was probably trying to protect me, following protocols designed to prevent financial elder abuse. But at the time, her questions felt intrusive, and Remy's impatient shifting beside me made me want to hurry through the process. I signed the papers, added his name to my account, and walked out feeling like I'd done something responsible and forward-thinking. For 6 months, nothing changed. My pension was deposited on the first of each month, bills were paid automatically, and life continued as normal. Remy was still working at the auto parts store, still helping around the house, still being the attentive grandson I'd hoped he would become. I had no idea that I'd just handed a master manipulator the keys to my entire financial life, and that, within 3 months, I'd be choosing between blood pressure medication and groceries while he planned the birthday party that would become his downfall. The change didn't happen overnight. That's what made it so insidious, so perfectly calculated. If Remy had emptied my account the day after being added to it, I would have known immediately what happened. But my grandson was smarter than that, or maybe just more cowardly. He started small, with transactions so minor I barely noticed them at first. It began with what he called emergencies. His car needed an oil change, and he was short $50 until payday. Could he borrow it from the account? Of course I said yes. His work boots had worn through, and he needed new ones immediately or he'd lose his job. Another $68. Again, I didn't hesitate. These weren't unreasonable requests from a young man trying to get his life together, and I reminded myself that I'd always helped family when they needed it. The requests became more frequent, though still seemingly legitimate. His phone bill was overdue, threatening disconnection. He needed gas money to get to work. The auto parts store was cutting his hours, and he was short on rent money for his contribution to household expenses, even though he wasn't paying me rent and never had. Each time, Remy would approach me with a sheepish expression, explaining the situation and promising to pay me back from his next paycheck. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But those paybacks never materialized. When I'd gently mention the money he owed, Remy would look confused, as if he didn't remember the loans, or he'd remind me of some household chore he'd done, fixing a leaky faucet, mowing the lawn, cleaning the gutters, and suggest that his labor had covered the debt. "I'm working off what I owe you, Grandma," he'd say with that charming smile. "My time and effort have to be worth something, right?" I started keeping better track of our financial interactions, writing down each loan in a small notebook I kept in my kitchen drawer. $20 here, $40 there, occasionally a larger amount for what Remy called real emergencies. By the end of the first month after he'd been added to my account, my notebook showed he'd borrowed $347. When I showed him the record, he seemed genuinely surprised by the total. "I had no idea it was so much, Grandma. I'm really sorry. I'll be more careful." But then he'd add, "You know, though, you're including the grocery money, and those groceries were for both of us. And the utility payment I made, that benefited you too. Maybe we should think about this differently." This became his pattern. Acknowledge the debt, express remorse, then immediately reframe the borrowing as something that benefited me or that he was entitled to. When I'd bought groceries for decades without his help, suddenly his eating my food meant I owed him for company and household assistance. When I'd paid my own utilities for 8 years as a widow, suddenly his contribution to the gas bill meant I was obligated to cover his other expenses. The amounts grew larger as Remy tested my boundaries. $100 for car repairs, $200 for what he claimed was a work-related training course that would qualify him for a promotion, $300 for a security deposit on his own apartment, an apartment that never materialized because, according to Remy, the landlord had discriminated against him, and he'd gotten his deposit back, though I never saw that money returned to my account. By the third month, I was seeing charges on my bank statements that I hadn't authorized and that Remy hadn't asked permission for. $50 at a restaurant I'd never heard of, $85 at a clothing store, $120 listed as ATM. Withdrawal, when I hadn't been to an ATM in months. When I confronted Remy about these transactions, he always had explanations. "I took you out to dinner at that restaurant last week, remember? We had the fish special. We hadn't eaten out together in over a month. Those clothes were work uniforms I needed for the auto parts store. The store provided uniforms. I withdrew that cash to pay the guy who fixed your garden hose. I'd fixed the garden hose myself with a 50-cent washer from the hardware store. But Remy delivered these explanations with such confidence, such detail, such wounded innocence when I questioned them that I began to doubt my own memory. Was I forgetting things? At 73, was my mind starting to slip the way my friend Maggie's had before she moved to the nursing home? The psychological manipulation was masterful. Remy would express concern about my confusion and forgetfulness, suggesting that maybe I should be grateful he was helping me manage my finances since I was clearly struggling to keep track of things myself. He'd point out times when I'd misplaced my reading glasses or forgotten a doctor's appointment, using these normal signs of aging as evidence that I wasn't competent to handle my own money. "Grandma, I'm worried about you," he'd say, his voice full of fake compassion. "Yesterday you asked me the same question 3 times about when I was working. And last week you thought you'd paid the electric bill when you hadn't. Maybe it's good that I'm here to help you stay organized." I wasn't developing dementia. I was developing anxiety. The constant questioning of my memory, the steady drain on my account, the growing realization that something was wrong, but not being able to prove it, all of this was making me second-guess everything. I thought I knew about my own life. The breaking point came in month 4 when I went to the ATM to withdraw money for groceries and discovered my account was overdrawn. Overdrawn. In 47 years of managing money, I had never, not once, overdrafted an account. I called the bank immediately, certain there had been some mistake. There was no mistake. According to my account history, I'd spent $2,147 in the past month alone, more than my entire monthly pension. The charges were all over the map: restaurants, bars, clothing stores, electronics purchases, cash withdrawals, and something called Premier Event Planning for $485. When I confronted Remy with the bank statement, he didn't even try to deny it anymore. Instead, he became angry, turning the situation around to make me the villain. "You're being paranoid, Grandma. I've been taking care of you, helping you, making sure you don't get confused with your bills. And this is how you repay me? By accusing me of stealing?" His voice rose, and for the first time since he'd moved in, I felt physically intimidated by my own grandson. "These charges," I said, my hands shaking as I held the bank statement. "I don't understand these charges." "Maybe you don't understand because you're not as sharp as you used to be," he snapped. "Maybe you should be grateful that someone is willing to help you manage your life instead of being suspicious all the time." But even through my confusion and self-doubt, one thing was crystal clear. My account was empty, my pension was gone, and my grandson was planning something with Premier Event Planning that was going to cost me nearly $500. Something I hadn't agreed to. Something I couldn't afford. Something that would soon reveal itself to be the most audacious theft of all. To understand how I became so vulnerable to Remy's manipulation, you need to understand the relationship I'd built with him over the years. A relationship founded on my own guilt, loneliness, and desperate desire to believe that family meant something. After Douglas moved to Seattle, our contact became sporadic at best. Oh, he'd call on holidays, send a generic birthday card, and occasionally email photos of his life out there. Pictures of him at company parties, hiking trips, expensive restaurants. But real conversation, the kind where family members actually know what's happening in each other's lives, became increasingly rare. Douglas had always been ambitious, even as a child, and success seemed to insulate him from the messier realities of family obligations. When Douglas and Coral divorced, I tried to stay neutral, but the truth was I barely knew Coral well enough to have an opinion. They'd only visited Cedar Falls twice during their marriage, once for Frank's funeral and once for Christmas 3 years later. Both visits had been brief, polite, and somehow exhausting. Coral was nice enough, but she and Douglas lived in a world of constant activity, endless plans, and conversations about people and places I'd never heard of. I felt like a tourist in my own son's life. After the divorce, Remy became a casualty of his parents' conflicting priorities. Douglas threw himself into work as a way of dealing with his failed marriage, often traveling for business or working. Late into the evening, Coral moved back to her hometown in Oregon and started a new life that didn't include much room for a teenage stepson who reminded her of her ex-husband. Remy spent summers and holidays shuttling between homes where he was welcome but not particularly wanted. That's when he started calling me more frequently. At first, I was thrilled. My grandson, whom I'd seen maybe a dozen times in his entire life, was reaching out, wanting to connect, asking about my life in Cedar Falls. He'd call every few weeks, always when he was feeling frustrated with his father's absence or his mother's new relationship, and I became his emotional refuge. "Grandma Dorothy," he'd say, his voice carrying that particular weight that teenagers use when they feel the world has wronged them. "You're the only one who really listens to me. Dad's always busy, and Mom just wants me to get along with her new boyfriend. Sometimes I think you understand me better than my own parents." These conversations made me feel needed in a way I hadn't experienced since Frank died. Remy would tell me about his struggles in school, his conflicts with teachers who didn't get him, his frustration with other kids who were fake and shallow. I'd listen for hours, offering gentle advice and unconditional support. When he complained about his parents' lack of understanding, I'd find myself defending him, making excuses for his behavior, and promising that things would get better. Looking back, I can see that even then, Remy was learning to manipulate me. He'd share just enough genuine vulnerability to make me feel trusted and important, then use that emotional connection to validate his increasingly skewed view of the world. When he got in trouble at school for cheating on a test, it became a story about a teacher who had it out for him. When he was caught shoplifting at 16, it became a narrative about peer pressure and feeling left out because his parents wouldn't buy him the clothes other kids had. Each time Remy got into trouble, I found myself sending money. $20 here, $50 there, to help him out of whatever jam he'd gotten himself into, a fine that needed to be paid. School supplies his parents had forgotten to provide. Gas money so he could visit me, though those visits never actually materialized. Douglas never knew about these financial gifts, and Remy was careful to swear me to secrecy each time. Dad wouldn't understand, he'd explain. He thinks money solves everything, but he doesn't get that sometimes people just need to know someone believes in them. You believe in me, don't you, Grandma? Of course I did. I wanted to believe that my love and support could make the difference in his life that his parents' money and neglect had failed to provide. I wanted to be the grandmother who saved him, who saw his potential when everyone else saw only problems. When Remy dropped out of college after one semester, I was the first person he called. Not his father, who was paying the tuition. Not his mother, who had helped him apply. Me. He was crying on the phone, telling me that the professors were biased, against him, that the other students had advantages he didn't have, that the whole system was rigged against people like him. I just feel so lost, Grandma, he sobbed. Everyone expects me to be like Dad, to be successful and driven and perfect. But what if I'm not cut out for that? What if I'm just meant to be ordinary? My heart broke for him. This was my grandson, my flesh and blood, struggling with the same insecurities and fears that every young person faces. I spent 2 hours on the phone that night, telling him that success wasn't about money or prestige, that there were many ways to build a meaningful life, that he had time to figure things out. I also sent him $500, money I could barely afford from my emergency savings, to help him get back on his feet while he figured out his next steps. He promised he'd pay me back as soon as he found a job, and I believed him because I needed to believe him. The pattern continued for the next 5 years. Remy would drift from job to job, apartment to apartment, relationship to relationship, and each time something went wrong, I'd get a phone call. His boss was unfair. His landlord was discriminating against him. His girlfriend was crazy. The system was rigged. Everyone was against him except for me, his grandmother who understood him, who saw his potential, who believed in him when no one else would. And each time, there would be a financial crisis that only I could help solve. He needed first month's rent for a new apartment. His car had broken down and he needed it for work. He owed money to someone and was afraid of what would happen if he didn't pay. The amounts got larger over time, and my emergency fund got smaller, but I told myself this was what family did for each other. Douglas remained largely unaware of his son's struggles because Remy had become expert at presenting different versions of himself to different people. To his father, he was the independent young man who was figuring things out and didn't need help. To me, he was the misunderstood grandson who was trying his best in a world that kept knocking him down. When Remy showed up at my door 2 years ago asking to move in, I saw it as an opportunity to finally provide the stable, loving environment he'd never really had. I thought that with consistent support and guidance, I could help him turn his life around. I thought that having family nearby would ease the loneliness that had become my constant companion since Frank died. I thought I was rescuing my grandson. I didn't realize he was about to rob me blind. The morning after I discovered the overdraft, I woke up to find Remy gone. Not just out for the day, gone. His bed hadn't been slept in, his car wasn't in the driveway, and when I called his cell phone, it went straight to voicemail. I spent the entire day alternating between worry that something terrible had happened to him and growing certainty that he was avoiding me because he knew I'd discovered what he'd been doing. He finally came home at nearly midnight, slipping into the house like a teenager breaking curfew. I was waiting for him in the living room, still in my robe, with the bank statements spread across the coffee table like evidence at a crime scene. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Remy looked at the papers, then at me, and for just a moment I saw something flicker across his face. Guilt, maybe, or fear. But it disappeared so quickly I wondered if I'd imagined it. "Grandma, it's really late. Can't this wait until tomorrow? I've had a really long day at work, and I'm exhausted." "You weren't at work. I called the auto parts store looking for you. They said you haven't shown up for 3 days." That was when the mask finally came off completely. Remy's expression hardened, and when he spoke, his voice carried a cold edge I'd never heard before. "You called my work? You're checking up on me now? What's next? Are you going to follow me around town? Interrogate my friends?" He moved closer to the coffee table, looking down at the bank statements with contempt rather than shame. "You know what this is really about? You're lonely and bored, and you're looking for drama because your life is empty." The cruelty of it took my breath away. This was my grandson, the boy I'd sent birthday money to for 27 years, the young man I'd opened my home and my heart to, telling me my life was empty. "Remy, please, just explain these charges to me. Help me understand what's happening with the account." He picked up one of the statements and waved it dismissively. "These are legitimate expenses, Grandma. You're just too old and confused to remember authorizing them. Maybe we should talk to Dad about getting you some kind of help, you know? Like a home health aide or something. Someone to keep track of things for you since you're obviously struggling." The threat was clear. If I continued to question him, he'd contact Douglas and paint me as a mentally declining elderly woman who needed supervision. Douglas, who barely called and knew nothing about my day-to-day life, would probably believe his son over his mother. After all, wasn't it more likely that a 73-year-old woman was getting confused than that her beloved grandson was stealing from her? But something inside me refused to back down. Maybe it was the 47 years I'd spent managing other people's money without making a single error. Maybe it was the memory of Frank, who'd always told me to trust my instincts. Or maybe I was just tired of being made to feel stupid and paranoid in my own home. "I'm not confused, Remy. I've been keeping track of money longer than you've been alive. These charges, $500 at Best Buy, $300 at some bar called The Dive, $485 at Premier Event Planning. I didn't authorize any of these." Remy's jaw tightened. "You did authorize them. You told me to handle the household expenses, remember? The TV in your bedroom was acting up, so I bought a new one. The Dive is where I took some friends for drinks to celebrate getting promoted. At work, you said I should socialize more, make connections. And Premier Event Planning is for my birthday party next month. You said you wanted to do something special for my 28th birthday, remember?" I didn't remember any of those conversations because they'd never happened. But Remy delivered. Each lie with such conviction that I found myself questioning my own memory again. Was it possible I'd agreed to these things and forgotten? Was this what the beginning of dementia felt like? Not dramatic memory loss, but a gradual erosion of certainty about your own experiences? "I don't remember agreeing to a birthday party," I said weakly. "Of course you don't remember. You don't remember a lot of things lately." Remy's voice took on a tone of exaggerated patience, as if he were speaking to a small child. "That's why I've been taking care of the finances. That's why I've been making the decisions. Because someone has to, and you're clearly not capable anymore." Over the following weeks, this became our new normal. My pension would be deposited on the 1st of each month, and by the 10th, the account would be nearly empty again. Remy had stopped even pretending to ask permission for purchases. He'd simply inform me after the fact that he'd taken care of various expenses, groceries that cost 3 times what I usually spent, utility payments that were mysteriously higher than they'd ever been, car maintenance that seemed to happen weekly. When I'd try to question the expenses, Remy would become either aggressively defensive or condescendingly patient, depending on his mood. He'd accuse me of being ungrateful for his help, or he'd express exaggerated concern about my mental state. Sometimes he'd do both in the same conversation. "I'm worried about you, Grandma," he'd say, shaking his head sadly. "You're becoming really paranoid and suspicious. Yesterday you accused me of stealing your reading glasses when they were right there on your head. And now you're questioning every little expense like I'm some kind of criminal instead of your grandson who's trying to take care of you." The gaslighting was systematic and relentless. Remy would move my belongings and then express concern when I couldn't find them. He'd change the thermostat and then suggest I was having hot flashes when I complained about the temperature. He'd use my car and return it with the radio presets changed, then act worried when I mentioned that things seemed different. Most insidiously, he began inviting himself to my doctor appointments, positioning himself as the concerned grandson who was keeping track of my health because I couldn't be trusted to remember important information. During these visits, he'd mention my confusion and forgetfulness to Dr. Martinez, my physician of 15 years, painting a picture of a woman in cognitive decline. "She's been having trouble with basic things," he'd say, his voice full of fake concern. "Forgetting conversations we just had, misplacing things constantly, getting confused about money. I moved in to help her, but I'm wondering if she needs more professional assistance." Dr. Martinez would look at me with new eyes after these conversations, asking pointed questions about my memory and mental state. I'd try to explain that I wasn't confused, that my grandson was the problem. But how do you prove that someone is manipulating you when they're sitting right there, looking like the picture of a devoted family member? The worst part was the isolation. Remy had gradually discouraged me from maintaining my few remaining friendships, suggesting that my friend Maggie was a bad influence because she'd asked too many questions about him, or that my neighbor Ian was probably just being nosy when he'd offered to help with yard work. One by one, the small connections that had kept me tethered to the outside world were severed. By winter, I was trapped in my own home with a grandson who had complete control over my finances and was systematically destroying my sense of reality. I'd wake up each morning hoping that today would be the day he'd go back to being the young man I'd tried to help, and I'd go to bed each night knowing that tomorrow would bring more of the same. My pension barely lasted 2 weeks each month. I was skipping meals, rationing my medications, and wearing sweaters indoors because Remy kept the heat turned down to save money. Money that somehow never stayed in the account anyway. But the worst humiliation was yet to come. Because while I was choosing between food and medicine, Remy was planning the most extravagant birthday party Cedar Falls had ever seen. A party that would cost more money than I spent in 3 months, a party funded entirely by my stolen pension, a party where he planned to play the role of successful young man surrounded by friends and admirers, a party that would become the scene of his downfall, though he had no idea what was coming. February arrived with one of those bitter Minnesota cold snaps that makes you wonder why anyone ever decided to live this far north. I was rationing my heating oil, keeping the thermostat at 62 degrees, and wearing layers of sweaters that made me feel like a bag lady in my own home. My arthritis was acting up from the cold, making it difficult to open pill bottles or even hold a pen properly, but I couldn't afford to turn the heat up because Remy had spent most of my February pension on what he called essential expenses. It was during this miserable cold spell that Remy came home one evening with an energy I hadn't seen from him in months. He was practically bouncing on his feet, his cheeks red from the cold, carrying a bottle of champagne that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a week. "Grandma," he called out as he kicked off his boots in the entryway. "We need to celebrate. I've got amazing news." I looked up from the kitchen table where I was sorting my medications, trying to figure out which ones I could skip to make them last longer. "What's the occasion?" "I got promoted at work." He popped the cork on the champagne, sending foam across my clean kitchen floor. Assistant manager. Can you believe it? After all those months of them not appreciating me, they finally realized what they had. This was the first I'd heard about Remy even being considered for a promotion. In fact, just the week before, he'd told me he was thinking about quitting because his manager was creating a hostile work environment by asking him to show up on time. That's wonderful, sweetheart, I said, genuinely happy to see him excited. About something positive for once. When does the promotion start? Next month. And here's the best part. I want to throw a proper celebration. A birthday party like I've never had before. Something that shows everyone I'm not just some loser who lives with his grandmother. I want to invite everyone from work, some old friends from high school, maybe even some people Dad might know. I want to show them all that I've made something of myself. He was pacing around the kitchen now, gesturing with the champagne bottle, painting a picture of the party he envisioned. We could rent out the community center, get it catered, maybe hire a DJ. Make it a real event, you know? The kind of party people will remember. My stomach sank as I realized where this conversation was heading. Remy, that sounds lovely, but parties like that cost money. Quite a bit of money. I know, he said, waving his hand dismissively. But this is an investment, Grandma. Think about it. If I throw a party that impresses people, that shows them I'm successful and have my life together, it opens doors. Networking, you know? Dad always talks about how important networking is for career advancement. He sat down across from me at the table, his expression shifting to that earnest, vulnerable look he'd perfected over the years. And it would mean so much to me if you were part of making this happen. You've been so supportive, so generous with helping me get my life on track. This party would be like a celebration of everything you've invested in me. The manipulation was masterful. He'd positioned the party not as something he wanted me to pay for, but as a return on investment, a chance to be part of his success story. And underneath it all was the implication that a grandmother who truly loved her grandson would want to help him celebrate this milestone. How much are we talking about? I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. Remy pulled out his phone and started scrolling through what looked like a notes app. Well, I've been doing some research. The community center rental is $300 for the evening. Catering for about 50 people would be around $800. DJ, decorations, maybe a cake from that fancy bakery downtown. He looked up with a sheepish smile. I'm thinking around $2,000 total. Maybe $2,500 to do it right. $2,000. More than my entire monthly pension. More than I'd spent on anything in the 8 years since Frank died. I felt physically sick. Remy, I don't have that kind of money. You know what my budget is like. You've been helping me manage it. But Grandma, he said, his voice taking on that wheedling tone that meant he was about to ask for something unreasonable. This isn't just for me. This is for both of us. Think about how proud you'll be when people see what a successful grandson you have. And think about all the connections I'll make that could lead to even better opportunities. He reached across the table and took my hand, his touch gentle but somehow possessive. Besides, it's not like we're spending money we don't have. My promotion comes with a raise. I'll be able to pay you back within a few months and then some. This is the turning point we've been waiting for. I wanted to believe him. God, how I wanted to believe that this time was different, that this time his optimism and grand plans would actually amount to something. But I'd heard variations of this same speech for years. The job that was going to change everything. The opportunity that was going to be his big break. The investment that would pay off in the long run. I need to think about it, I said finally. Remy's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained cheerful. Of course. I wouldn't want you to make a hasty decision. But the thing is, if we're going to book the community center and the caterer, we need to move pretty quickly. Good venues get reserved fast, especially for weekend dates. Over the next 3 days, Remy launched a sustained campaign to convince me. He brought home brochures from catering companies, showed me photos of beautifully decorated community center events, played music he thought would be perfect for the party. He painted vivid pictures of the guest list, co-workers who would be impressed by his success, old friends who would see how well he'd turned out, maybe even his father flying in from Seattle for the celebration. Imagine Dad's face when he sees the kind of event I can put together, Remy said, his eyes bright with anticipation. He's always thought I was a screw-up, but this would show him I'm serious about my life, about making something of myself. The idea of Douglas finally seeing his son as successful, of our family having something to celebrate together for the first time in years, was powerfully appealing. Despite everything that had happened with the bank account, despite my growing suspicions about Remy's truthfulness, I found myself getting caught up in his vision. Maybe this really was his turning point. Maybe the promotion was real. And maybe throwing this party would give him the confidence and connections he needed to build a better life. Maybe I was being paranoid and selfish, holding on to money when I could be investing in my grandson's future. On the 4th day, I told him yes. The moment I said yes to funding Remy's birthday party, everything changed. It was as if my agreement had given him permission to drop any remaining pretense of concern for my well-being or financial security. Within hours of my decision, he was on the phone with vendors, booking services, and making commitments that would drain what little remained of my savings. "I've reserved the community center for March 15th, he announced the next morning, waving a confirmation email he'd printed out. Saturday night, 7 to midnight. And I found this amazing caterer who can do a full dinner buffet plus an open bar. It's going to be incredible, Grandma. Everyone's going to be so impressed." I noticed he'd upgraded from the original $800 catering estimate to something that included an open bar. But when I asked about the cost difference, Remy waved off my concerns. "It's only a few hundred more, and it makes such a difference. You want people to have a good time, don't you? You want them to see that your grandson knows how to throw a proper celebration?" The requests for money came daily now, each one presented as an essential element of the party that couldn't possibly be eliminated. Professional decorations because we can't just hang streamers like it's a kid's birthday party. A 3-tier cake from the most expensive bakery in town because people judge you by details like that. Printed invitations on heavy cardstock because email invitations look cheap. Each expense was positioned as an investment in Remy's future, and each time I hesitated, he'd remind me that this was my chance to be part of his success story. But more concerning was how he'd begun talking about the party as if it were already a done deal, regardless of the financial reality. "I invited my old manager from the cell phone store," he told me one evening. "And Jenny from high school. You remember Jenny, right? She's married to a lawyer now. Oh, and I called Dad to tell him about the party. He seemed really interested, said he might fly out for it. Douglas? Interested in attending one of Remy's events?" That seemed unlikely. But when I suggested calling my son to confirm, Remy quickly changed the subject. The breaking point came on a Wednesday morning in early March. I'd gone to the bank to withdraw money for groceries and discovered that my account balance was $43.67. My March pension had been deposited just 5 days earlier. I sat in my car in the bank parking lot, staring at the ATM receipt, trying to understand how this had happened. My pension was $1,847. Even with Remy's party expenses, there should have been more left. I drove straight home, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, to confront him with the evidence. I found Remy in the kitchen, on the phone with someone, discussing what sounded like additional party arrangements. No, we definitely want the premium package," he was saying. "Money's not an issue. My grandmother is covering everything and she wants this to be perfect." He noticed me standing in the doorway and held up a finger, indicating he'd be off. The phone in a moment. But something in my expression must have alarmed him because he quickly ended the call. "Everything okay, Grandma?" You look upset. I set the ATM receipt on the kitchen counter between us. Explain this to me. Remy glanced at the receipt, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I saw genuine alarm cross his face. But it wasn't the alarm of someone caught doing something wrong. It was the alarm of someone whose plans might be threatened. Okay, I know that looks bad, he said quickly. But there's a perfectly reasonable explanation. The caterer required a larger deposit than we expected, and the DJ needed payment up front, and there were some additional fees for the community center that weren't in the original quote. Remy, this is my entire month's income. How am I supposed to buy food? How am I supposed to pay the utility bills? Don't worry about that, he said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd grown to hate. The party's in less than 2 weeks. After that, everything changes. My promotion, the networking opportunities, the connections I'll make. This investment is going to pay off huge, you'll see. What promotion? The words came out louder than I'd intended. What promotion, Remy? I called the auto parts store yesterday to ask if you'd be working late, and they told me you were fired 3 weeks ago for not showing up. The silence that followed was deafening. Remy's face went through a series of expressions, surprise, anger, calculation, before settling into a look of cold determination I'd never seen before. You called my work again? After I told you how embarrassing that was for me? His voice was quiet, dangerous. You know what? Maybe they told you I was fired because they don't want to admit they made a mistake. Maybe they're covering their asses because they know they treated me unfairly. Remy, there is no promotion. There is no job, and there's no money left for this party. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. There's going to be a party, Grandma. I've already sent out the invitations. I've already made commitments to people. Do you understand what it would do to my reputation if I had to? Cancel now? Your reputation? I could hardly believe what I was hearing. What about my ability to survive? What about my medications, my groceries, my heating bill? Your medications are covered by Medicare. You can get free food from the church if you need to, and it's almost spring, so you don't need as much heat. He was pacing now, his voice rising. But this party, this is my one chance to show everyone that I'm not a failure, that I'm not just some loser who lives with his grandmother. The casual cruelty of his words, suggesting I could live on charity while he threw himself a lavish party, broke something inside me. This wasn't my grandson anymore. This wasn't the confused young man I'd been trying to help. This was a stranger who had been systematically robbing me while I worried about his future. There will be no party, I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. I'm going to the bank tomorrow to remove you from my account. Remy stopped pacing and turned to look at me with an expression that made me take a step backward. No, you're not. Yes, I am. This has gone too far. You're not removing me from anything, he said, moving closer. Because if you do, I'll have to call Adult Protective Services and report that you're having serious mental health issues. I'll tell them about your confusion, your memory problems, your inability to manage your finances responsibly. I'll tell them that you're living in unsafe conditions, that you're not taking your medications properly, that you need supervised care. The threat hung in the air between us like a physical thing. I realized that this was what Remy had been building toward all along. Not just access to my money, but complete control over my life. And just so we're clear, he continued, his voice soft and menacing, the party is happening. All the arrangements have been made. All the money has been spent. Whether you like it or not, on March 15th, I'm going to be celebrating my 28th Mao birthday in style. He walked past me toward the doorway, then paused and looked back. Oh, and Grandma? You're going to be there. You're going to smile and play the role of the proud grandmother who's so happy to support her successful grandson. Because if you don't, if you try to ruin this for me, I promise you'll regret it. As I listened to his footsteps going up the stairs to his room, I realized that I had 2 weeks to figure out how to stop him. 2 weeks before he threw a party that would cost more than I made in 2 months, using money stolen from a 73-year-old woman who was now choosing between food and medicine because of his greed. But Remy had made one crucial mistake in his threats and manipulations. He'd assumed that because I was old and trusting, I was also helpless. He was about to learn how wrong he was. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold hours ago, staring at the empty space where my checkbook used to be. Remy had taken it along with my debit card, claiming he needed to handle the party arrangements more efficiently. The house was silent except for the sound of him upstairs, probably on the phone with more vendors, spending money I didn't have on a celebration I couldn't afford. For the first time since this nightmare began, I allowed myself to see the situation clearly, without the filter of hope or denial that had clouded my judgment for so long. My grandson had stolen my life savings. He'd manipulated me, threatened me, and was now holding my financial future hostage for a party that existed solely to feed his ego, and I had let it happen. I thought about Frank, about how disappointed he would be to see me in this situation. Frank, who taught me to be strong, to trust my instincts, to never let anyone push me around. Dorothy, he used to say when I'd worry about seeming too aggressive or demanding. Being nice doesn't mean being a doormat. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to not enable their worst behavior. I'd failed to follow that advice with Remy. I'd enabled him, supported him, made excuses for him, and ultimately become his victim. But sitting there in my kitchen, feeling more alone and vulnerable than I had since Frank died, I realized something important. I wasn't actually helpless. I was angry. The anger was clean and bright and clarifying. It burned away the confusion and self-doubt that Remy had spent months cultivating in me. I wasn't losing my mind. I wasn't confused or forgetful or incompetent. I was a 73-year-old woman who had managed money professionally for 47 years, and I was being robbed by someone who was counting on my love for him to keep me quiet. Well, I was done being quiet. I went to my bedroom and pulled out a shoebox from under my bed, the same shoebox where I'd kept important documents since Frank and I were first married. Inside were copies of my bank statements going back 2 years, my pension documents, insurance papers, and most importantly, the small notebook where I'd been tracking Remy's loans since he'd first been added to my account. I spread everything out on my kitchen table and began to reconstruct the theft systematically. The notebook told one story, the modest borrowing that I'd been aware of and had chosen to tolerate. But the bank statements told a different story, entirely. Starting 3 months after Remy gained access to my account, there were charges I'd never authorized and transactions I'd never been told about. Cash withdrawals at ATMs across town, always for amounts just under the daily limit. Charges at restaurants and bars I'd never heard of. Online purchases for everything from clothing to electronics to what looked like dating app subscriptions. The pattern was clear. Remy had been living an entirely separate lifestyle funded by my pension while pretending to struggle financially in front of me. But the party expenses were the most damning evidence. The premier event planning charge I'd seen months ago wasn't the beginning of the party planning. It was just the first time he'd been careless enough to use a vendor name I might recognize. Going back through the statements, I found charges to caterers, rental companies, and entertainment services dating back 6 months. Remy had been planning this elaborate birthday party long before he'd ever mentioned it to me, and he'd been spending my money on it the entire time. The total was staggering. Over the past year, Remy had stolen more than $18,000 from me. $18,000 that represented not just money, but my security, my independence, my ability to take care of myself in my old age. I looked at the clock, on the kitchen wall, 2:47 a.m. Remy had been quiet upstairs for over an hour, probably asleep, dreaming about his upcoming party and all the attention it would bring him. I made a decision that would change everything. I picked up my phone and dialed 411. Directory assistance, what city and state? Cedar Falls, Minnesota. I need the non-emergency number for the police department. The operator connected me, and after 3 rings, a tired-sounding dispatcher answered. Cedar Falls Police, this is Officer Martinez. How can I help you? My name is Dorothy Kellerman, and I need to report a theft. A significant theft that's been going on for months. Are you in immediate danger, ma'am? No, I'm safe, but I need to file a report about financial elder abuse. My grandson has been stealing from my bank account. There was a pause. Then Officer Martinez's voice became more alert. Ma'am, financial elder abuse is a serious crime. Can you tell me more about what's been happening? For the next 20 minutes, I laid out everything. The gradual manipulation, the unauthorized charges, the threats when I'd tried to confront Remy about the missing money. Officer Martinez listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification about dates or amounts. Mrs. Kellerman, based on what you're telling me, this does sound like a clear case of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Have you documented any of this? I have bank statements, a notebook where I tracked the money he borrowed, and copies of charges he made without my permission. Altogether, he's stolen over $18,000. That's a felony amount. We'll need to send an officer to take a formal statement and collect copies of your documentation. Would you be comfortable coming to the station tomorrow morning? Or would you prefer we come to you? I thought about Remy upstairs, probably sleeping, peacefully while I sat surrounded by evidence of his crimes. I'll come to you. I don't want him to know about this yet. That's probably wise. Financial abuse cases can escalate when the perpetrator feels cornered. Is there somewhere safe you can stay until we can investigate this properly? I considered. The question, where could a 73-year-old woman go at 3 a.m? My neighbor Ian had always been kind, but I barely knew him well enough to impose. My friend Maggie was in the nursing home. Douglas was 3 time zones away and would probably side with his son anyway. I'll be fine here for now, I said. But I want you to know, he's planning a party for this Saturday night using the money he stole from me. A big party at the community center with dozens of guests. If you're going to arrest him, that might be the perfect time to do it. Officer Martinez was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Kellerman, are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting? I'm suggesting that justice should be public, I said, surprised by the steel in my own voice. He humiliated me by stealing my money and threatening me in my own home. Maybe it's time he experienced a little humiliation of his own. We'll discuss options when you come in tomorrow. Can you be here by 9 a.m? I'll be there. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen until dawn, surrounded by the evidence of my grandson's betrayal, feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Not hope that Remy would change or that our relationship could be salvaged, but hope that justice was possible. Hope that sometimes the people who prey on the elderly find out that their victims are stronger than they look. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm, dressed in my best outfit, a navy blue dress I'd worn to church for the past 5 years, and drove to the Cedar Falls Police Department. The building was smaller than I'd expected, tucked between a hardware store and a diner on Main Street, but the officer who met me, Detective Sarah Callahan, treated my case with the seriousness it deserved. Mrs. Kellerman, financial elder abuse, is one of the fastest-growing crimes in our jurisdiction, she said as we sat in a small interview room with a tape recorder between us. What you're describing, the gradual isolation, the manipulation, the threats when you tried to resist, it's a textbook case. I handed her copies of all my documentation, the bank statements, my notebook tracking the unauthorized loans, even screenshots of Remy's social media posts showing him at expensive restaurants and bars that I'd unknowingly paid for. Detective Callahan studied everything carefully, occasionally asking questions about specific dates or transactions. "The total amount stolen is over the felony threshold," she said finally. "That's a minimum of 3 years in prison, possibly much more given the victim's age and the systematic nature of the abuse. But, Mrs. Kellerman, I need to ask, are you prepared for what comes next? Pressing charges against a family member is emotionally difficult, and defense attorneys often try to paint elderly victims as confused or vindictive." I thought about Remy's threats, about his promise to have me declared mentally incompetent if I tried to stop him. "Detective, I managed other people's money for 47 years without a single discrepancy. I raised a son, buried a husband, and maintained my independence through 8 years of widowhood. If anyone thinks I'm too confused to know when I'm being robbed, they're welcome to test me." Detective Callahan smiled for the first time since we'd started talking. "That's exactly the attitude we need. Now, you mentioned something last night about the timing of the arrest. Tell me more about this party." I explained about the elaborate celebration Remy had planned, how he'd invited dozens of people to see him play the role of successful young man, how the entire event was funded by money stolen from me. Detective Callahan took notes as I talked, occasionally raising an eyebrow at the audacity of it all. "A public arrest would certainly send a message," she said thoughtfully, "but it's also risky. Party guests might interfere, or your grandson might become violent when he realizes what's happening. Are you sure that's how you want this to play out?" I was quiet for a moment, thinking about all the times Remy had humiliated me in private, all the ways he'd made me feel small and powerless and confused. Then I thought about him standing in that community center, accepting congratulations from friends who had no idea the party was funded by theft, playing the part of someone who'd earned success instead of stolen it. Detective Callahan, my grandson, has spent months making me feel like I was losing my mind, like I was too old and confused to manage my own life. He's threatened to have me declared incompetent if I tried to stop him from stealing from me. He's counting on me being too embarrassed or too afraid to fight back. I met her eyes across the small table. "I want him arrested at his party, in front of everyone he's trying to impress. I want them all to know exactly what kind of person he really is." "Then that's exactly what we'll do." The week leading up to Remy's party was the strangest of my life. While he bustled around the house making final arrangements for what he called the event of the year, I was quietly coordinating with Detective Callahan to ensure his arrest would go smoothly. The irony wasn't lost on me. For months, Remy had been living a double life, and now I was doing the same thing. "The key is to act completely normal," Detective Callahan advised during one of our phone calls. "Don't change your routine, don't act suspicious, and absolutely don't let him know you've contacted us. Financial abusers can become dangerous when they feel trapped." Acting normal was harder than I'd expected. Every time Remy mentioned the party, every time he showed me a new detail he'd added or bragged about someone who was coming, I had to force myself to smile and nod like the supportive grandmother he expected me to be. Inside, I was counting down the hours until his elaborate facade came crashing down. On Wednesday, 3 days before the party, Remy came home with a garment bag from an expensive men's store downtown. "I bought a new suit for Saturday," he announced, hanging it carefully in the front hall closet. "Hugo Boss. Cost more than most. People spend on rent, but image is everything, you know?" I knew exactly how much it had cost because I recognized the charge on my bank statement. $247 for a single suit, bought with my stolen pension money. But I just smiled and told him I was sure he'd look very handsome. That same afternoon, Detective R. Callahan called with the final details. "We'll have 2 officers stationed outside the community center starting at 7 p.m. Plain clothes, unmarked car. At 8:30, after the party is well underway and most guests have arrived, they'll enter and make the arrest. We want to ensure maximum attendance for impact." She paused, then added, "Mrs. Kellerman, are you absolutely certain you want to be there when this happens? It might be traumatic to watch." "I'll be there," I said firmly. I want to see his face when he realizes that his grandmother isn't as helpless as he thought. Friday evening, Remy was practically vibrating with excitement. He'd spent the day doing what he called final preparations, picking up the cake, confirming details with the caterer, and apparently getting his hair cut at some expensive salon because he looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine. "Tomorrow, night is going to change everything, Grandma," he said as we sat down for what would be our last dinner together in my house. "After people see what I'm capable of, the opportunities are going to start rolling in. Dad's going to finally respect me. Everyone who ever doubted me is going to see that they were wrong." He was so animated, so confident, so completely convinced that his stolen party was going to launch him into a better life. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "I'm very proud of you, Remy," I said. And for once, I wasn't lying. I was proud that I'd found the courage to stop him. Proud that I'd gathered the evidence to ensure justice would be served. Proud that I'd refused to let him destroy my life. Just not for the reasons he thought. Saturday morning, Remy left early to oversee the setup at the community center. "I want everything perfect," he called out as he loaded boxes of decorations into his car. "See you tonight, Grandma. 7 sharp. And wear something nice. There's going to be a photographer." After he left, I sat in my quiet house and called, "Detective Callahan, one final time." "Everything's in place," she confirmed. "Are you ready for this?" I looked around my kitchen, at the table where I'd discovered the extent of Remy's theft, at the phone where I'd made the call that started this whole process, at the empty space where my checkbook used to be. "I've been ready for months," I said. "I just didn't know it yet." At exactly 7 o'clock that Saturday evening, I walked into the Cedar Falls Community Center wearing my best dress, the same navy blue one I'd worn to the police station, and a small smile that Remy interpreted as grandmotherly pride. He rushed over to greet me, looking resplendent in his stolen Hugo Boss suit, his face glowing with anticipation. "Grandma, you look beautiful. Come on, let me introduce you to everyone." The community center had been transformed. Professional. Decorations in gold and black draped the walls, elegant centerpieces adorned every table, and a DJ was setting up equipment that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. It was, I had to admit, impressive. It was also the most expensive crime scene I'd ever seen. Remy guided me around the room like a proud host, introducing me to his guests with the kind of enthusiasm I hadn't seen from him in years. There were people from his old job at the auto parts store, the job he'd been fired from weeks ago. Former high school classmates who looked surprised to be there. A few neighbors I recognized but had never spoken to. Most telling of all, there were several older adults who looked like they might be parents of his friends, brought along to witness his apparent success. "This is my amazing grandmother," Remy would say to each group. "She's been so supportive of my career advancement. I couldn't have done any of this without her." The irony was so thick I could taste it. He was literally introducing me as his enabler to a room full of people, at a party funded entirely by theft, while 2 police officers waited outside to arrest him for elder abuse. If the situation weren't so tragic, it would have been almost funny. At 8:15, I excused myself to use the restroom, but instead slipped outside to check in with Detective Callahan and her partner, who were parked across the street in an unmarked sedan. "How are you holding up, Mrs. Kellerman?" Detective Callahan asked through the slightly open car window. "I'm fine. He's in there playing the part of successful young man perfectly. Most of the guests have arrived. We'll move in 15 minutes. Are you sure you want to stay for this?" I looked back at the community center, warm light spilling from its windows, the sound of laughter and music drifting across the parking lot. Inside, my grandson was probably regaling his guests with stories about his bright future, accepting congratulations for achievements he'd never earned, basking in admiration purchased with my stolen pension. I wouldn't miss it for the world. Back inside, I found Remy at the center of a small group, holding court near the elaborate cake he'd commissioned. He was telling them about his promotion and his plans for the future, gesturing with the kind of animated confidence that comes from believing your own lies. "The key is taking calculated risks," he was saying to a young woman I didn't recognize. "My grandmother always taught me that you have to invest in yourself if you want others to invest in you." I nearly choked on my punch. Investment. As if stealing $18,000 from an elderly woman was a business strategy rather than a felony. At 8:28, I positioned myself where I could see both Remy and the front entrance. My heart was pounding, but not from fear, from anticipation. For months, I'd felt powerless, confused, manipulated. Tonight, that was all going to change. At 8:31, Detective Callahan and Officer Martinez walked through the front door. The moment Detective Callahan and Officer Martinez entered the community center, the entire atmosphere changed. They moved with quiet authority, their eyes scanning the room until they located their target. Remy was still holding court near the cake table, completely oblivious to what was about to happen. I watched from across the room as Detective Callahan approached him, her badge clearly visible now. The conversation happened in low tones at first, but I could see Remy's expression transform from confusion to disbelief to dawning horror as he realized what was happening. "Remy Kellerman." Detective Callahan's voice suddenly cut through the party noise, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're under arrest for financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, theft in the first degree, and fraud." The music stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence. 50 people turned to stare as Officer Martinez moved behind Remy, producing handcuffs with practiced efficiency. The birthday boy, in his stolen Hugo Boss suit, surrounded by decorations bought with my pension money, was being arrested at his own party. "This is a mistake," Remy said, his voice rising in panic. "I haven't done anything wrong. Grandma, tell them. Tell them you gave me permission to use your account." All eyes turned to me. This was the moment Remy had been counting on, his confused, elderly grandmother stepping in to rescue him, just like I'd been doing for years. Instead, I walked calmly to where he stood, now with his hands cuffed behind his back, and looked him directly in the eye. "I gave you access to my account to help with emergencies," I said, my voice clear and steady in the silent room. "I never gave you permission to steal $18,000 from me. I never gave you permission to forge my signature on withdrawals. I never gave you permission to threaten me when I questioned the missing money." Remy's face went white. Around us, his guests were murmuring, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. The woman he'd been impressing with his business philosophy looked horrified. His former co-workers were backing away as if criminality might be contagious. "You don't understand," Remy said desperately, still trying to control the narrative. "She's confused. She has memory problems. She forgets conversations we've had. I was helping her manage her finances because she can't do it herself anymore." Detective Callahan stepped forward. "Mr. Kellerman, your grandmother has provided extensive documentation of your unauthorized transactions, bank records, photographs, of forged signatures, a detailed log of every theft you committed. Her memory seems just fine to me." As Officer Martinez began leading Remy toward the exit, he made one last attempt to salvage his reputation. "This party cost $2,000, he called out to the crowd. $2,000 that my grandmother wanted to spend on my birthday. Ask her if she didn't want me to have this party." I followed them toward the door, and when Remy looked back at me with desperate, pleading eyes, I gave him the answer he was looking for. "You're right, Remy. This party did cost about $2,000, but you spent over $18,000 on yourself this year. This party was just the last straw that made me realize I had to stop you before you bankrupted me completely." The gasps from his guests were audible. Someone behind me whispered, $18,000? From his grandmother? As they reached the exit, Remy made one final pathetic attempt. "Grandma, please. Don't let them do this to me. I'm your grandson. I'm family. I stopped walking and looked at him, really looked at him, for what I knew would be the last time. Family doesn't steal from family, Remy. Family doesn't threaten to have their grandmother declared mentally incompetent when she tries to protect herself. Family doesn't choose between their grandmother's medication and their own entertainment. I paused, then added the words that felt like liberation. You stopped being my family the day you decided I was just an ATM with a pulse. As the police car pulled away with Remy in the back seat, I turned back to face the stunned party guests. Most were already gathering their coats and purses, clearly uncomfortable with the evening's dramatic turn. But a few approached me with expressions of sympathy and admiration. "Ma'am," said one of the older guests, a woman about my age, "I just want to say how brave you are. My sister went through something similar with her son, but she never had the courage to press charges." Another woman nodded. "Financial elder abuse is so much more common than people realize. You probably prevented him from doing this to someone else." As I walked to my car through the community center parking lot, past the decorations and catering trucks that represented my stolen money, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Justice had been served, publicly and completely, and I was finally free. 6 months later, I'm sitting in my kitchen on Maple Street, but everything has changed. The house feels lighter somehow, as if a dark cloud that had been hanging over it for 2 years has finally lifted. My checkbook sits in its proper place in the kitchen drawer. My debit card is safely in my wallet. My pension goes exactly where it's supposed to go, toward my groceries, my medications, my utilities, and my simple but comfortable life. Remy was sentenced to 4 years in state prison for financial elder abuse and fraud. The judge, a stern woman about my age named Magistrate Chen, made it clear that crimes against the elderly would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law in her courtroom. Douglas flew in from Seattle for the sentencing, spending most of his time apologizing to me and trying to understand how his son had become someone capable of such calculated cruelty. "I failed him," Douglas said as we sat in my living room after the hearing. "I was so focused on my career, on building my own success, that I never taught him the values that really matter." "You didn't fail him," I replied. "You gave him opportunities, education, and support. What he chose to do with those gifts was his decision, not yours. The restitution process has been slow but steady. The court ordered the liquidation of everything Remy had purchased with my stolen money: the electronics, the expensive clothes, even that Hugo Boss suit. Between the restitution and my own careful budgeting, I've managed to rebuild my emergency fund. More importantly, I've rebuilt my confidence. I'm no longer the confused, manipulated woman who second-guessed every memory and questioned every instinct. I know exactly who I am. Dorothy Kellerman, 73 years old, sharp as a tack, and nobody's victim. The community center still hosts parties and celebrations, but now when I drive past it, I don't feel shame or anger. I feel proud. That building represents the night I refused to be silent, the night I chose justice over family loyalty, the night I proved that being elderly doesn't mean being helpless. Sometimes love means setting boundaries. Sometimes family means knowing when to walk away. And sometimes, the most loving thing a grandmother can do is teach her grandson that actions have consequences, even if he has to learn that lesson from behind bars. My pension check arrived this morning, deposited safely into an account that only I can access. It's not much money by most standards, but it's mine. And that makes all the difference in the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.